This video will provide a brief introduction to the topic of evaluating arguments, whether you find them on a website or in a book or a journal article. It's going to be a first steps approach because this is a very complex topic and there's a lot to say in the area of critical thinking, so I can't possibly cover all of that in one video. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is asking what an argument is. And the basic definition that you'll often run across is an argument consists of a set of premises which are intended to support a conclusion. And the purpose of an argument is to persuade others that an idea is right or wrong, and not persuade them using coercion or something like that, but rather to persuade them with reason and evidence. And there's a great video that Monty Python has actually done, which is a skit actually about arguments and what arguments really aren't. And so an argument isn't really necessarily a just contrary naysaying of what someone else says, but it's actually an engaged dialogue where evidence is considered and presented, and that's sort of the ideal picture of an argument. Alright, so an argument is broken down into different parts, and I've already mentioned there's conclusions, there's premises, and the premises in some way support the conclusion. So the conclusion, again, is just the claim that the author is trying to establish, and it's something that requires justification. And on the other hand, a premise is something that is essentially thought of as evidence. It's something that's used to support a conclusion. And a good premise should ideally be more well confirmed than the conclusion, or the thing that it's trying to support. Because, for example, if I told you, despite contrary evidence, the world is flat, and the reason I gave you was that, believe me, I've sailed off its edge into space, right? My premise is not as believable as the conclusion. So really, you're in no better position in trying to evaluate my claim. In fact, you've got no reason to accept it, given the only evidence I've given you is something that itself is very questionable. Okay, so how do we identify the parts of an argument? And this might seem like it's a pretty straightforward task, but when arguments get complicated and longer and embedded across a whole book or a larger paper, it can be often easy to sort of lose track of these things. So conclusions, again, are claims which require support. And one way to identify them is to ask yourself whether or not you would believe it without being given reasons. And if it is a claim that's not common knowledge, and it also looks like the other information in the paper or the article is actually trying to support this claim, then that's the thing that is likely the conclusion. And there's a lot of linguistic indicators that we often use in writing to note conclusions. So you can see therefore, or so, or thus, hence, it follows that, consequently. And these are really just, a sample of the possible linguistic indicators that you might see. Now, it's worth noting that you're not always going to see these linguistic indicators, but they do, when you see them, indicate conclusions. Premises, on the other hand, as I've been saying, are used to support other claims. They're there to provide reasons for believing in conclusions. And they have linguistic indicators too. So since, because, as a result of, it follows from, those are all different kinds of premise indicators. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. But the general idea is, when you see something and you're not sure whether it's acting as a premise or conclusion, you can ask yourself, is this claim does it look like it's being used to defend some other claim? Is it evidence that would be used to make a conclusion more believable, or is it something that is itself requiring support? Okay. So simple arguments, it's relatively easy to keep track of when you just have a few sentences, right? It's easy to see what the conclusion is, what the premise is, and what the relationship between them is. However, in longer articles, again, complex arguments can be harder to keep track of. So what I'm going to suggest is that you actually map out the relationships between premises and conclusions, and that's really going to help you come to terms with what the argument is, what the important aspects of the argument is, and what the supporting relationships are. So here's a sample map that I've done. So, and this isn't even a terribly complex argument either. So we have a conclusion. We've got two premises which are supporting it, and then these two premises themselves have other premises that are supporting them. So these premises, premise 5 and premise 6, are essentially sub-conclusions. Now, One thing you might notice is that there's a difference between how these two premises are related, 1 and 2, and how premise 3 and 4 are related. So here, I've drawn a line between them showing that there's some kind of connection between them. And here, there's no such line. There's just two arrows going to premise 6. The idea here is that there are different kinds of relationships between premises, so they can work together to support a conclusion in different ways. So here, for example, is here is an example of a premise of this type here, P1 to P2. If administration doesn't take drastic measures to reduce harmful emissions, then global warming will continue to accelerate. The current administration won't take drastic measures, so global warming will continue to accelerate. In this case, premise 1 and 2 are connected. They're working together in order to support this conclusion. So this one is a conditional claim, and this is information that ties in to this conditional. So it's an if-then claim, and this is essentially the antecedent or the left-hand side of the if-then claim. And these two things work together to support this conclusion. On the other hand, and this represents P3 and P4, this represents P3 and P4, we have two premises which are working independently. There's not necessarily a relationship between them. So the present administration isn't taking drastic measures to reduce emissions. The industry in developing countries is even less regulated. Conclusion, so global warming will continue to accelerate. So in this case, premise 1 and premise 2 on the right here are not actually working together. They're both providing support for the conclusion, but doing that independently. They don't rely on one another. Whereas there's a reliance in this case. These two need to work together in order to support that conclusion. Okay, so the premises of a good argument should increase the likelihood of the conclusions that they support are true. So this is sort of the thing to keep in mind when you're looking at premises and conclusions and the value of an argument. Good premises should increase the likelihood of the conclusion. It should make them more believable. But there's a lot of ways in which premises can fail to be relevant in that way, or fail to sort of help you increase the likelihood of accepting the conclusion. So often you might see an attack on the person and not the argument. Or you might see an illegitimate appeal to authority, or appeals to emotion, or sometimes things are just plain relevant. This doesn't actually affect the conclusion in any way. So these are things that are common fallacies which you may have run across before, but if not, these are things that you can look up and go into find some more detail about. All right. Another thing that's really important is to look for references. So if an author makes an appeal to evidence, so if, for example, someone says in a paper that 65% of Halifax residents lived below the poverty line in 2006, well, it's a very specific claim that should be backed up by some kind of data. And a good argument or a good paper is going to actually provide you with the reference for that data. And not only that, it should also provide a quality reference. So it shouldn't just be referring to some hearsay or conjecture somewhere else in another bad article. Ideally, you would have some kind of statistical data that you could refer to in this case. So maybe something in the StatsCan website where this data has actually been collected. So that's another thing to look for is when a specific claim like this is made that makes appeals to evidence, check to see that that evidence is backed up by a reference. And in general, the best attitude to have is a skeptical attitude. And by this I just mean don't just take everything for granted. Think about what's being presented to you in an argument and ask, do I have good reasons to believe this? Is the author really making a compelling case for what they're claiming? So just to summarize, once you know what an argument is, you want to be able to identify the premises and conclusion. Next, you want to map out the argument to better understand what the relationship between its parts is. so it makes it easier to then scrutinize and evaluate. You want to, in general, ask yourself, do the premises that are presented increase the likelihood that the conclusion that they're supporting is true? And when you're given specific evidence, it's always good to check for references to make sure that that data is actually legitimate. And in general, evaluating arguments just takes a skeptical mindset to stop and ask, what is going on here, and am I being given enough evidence to actually believe what's being presented?